The moment my nephew Derek called me senile in front of the entire family, I knew it was time to remind everyone exactly who controlled the purse strings around here. My name is Lorraine Washington. I'm 67 years old, and I've spent the last 40 years building a fortune that my ungrateful relatives seem to think they're entitled to without lifting a finger. The annual family reunion was supposed to be a celebration. 3 generations gathered in my sprawling backyard, children running between the picnic tables while adults filled their plates with barbecue and potato salad. The sun beat down mercilessly on this July afternoon, but the old oak trees provided enough shade to keep everyone comfortable. I'd hired caterers this year, something I never used to do, but at my age, I figured I deserved to enjoy the party instead of spending the whole day in the kitchen. I sat in my usual spot on the back porch, watching the chaos unfold. My daughter Cheryl was chasing her youngest around the swing set, her husband Marcus manning the grill with an expertise that made me proud. My son James had driven down from Atlanta with his wife and twin boys, and they were currently engaged in a heated game of horseshoes with my brother Robert and his clan. But it was Derek who caught my attention. My sister's grandson, 28 years old and full of himself since landing that job at the tech company. He stood near the beverage table with his cousins, gesticulating wildly as he always did when he thought he was making an important point. "I'm telling you, we need to start thinking about this stuff now," Derek was saying, his voice carrying farther than he probably intended. "Grandma Lorraine isn't getting any younger, and somebody needs to keep an eye on the finances before she starts making crazy decisions." His cousin Malik nodded along, though I could see the discomfort in his posture. "Man, maybe we shouldn't be talking about this here." "Why not?" Derek's voice rose even higher. "Look at her just sitting there. She barely knows what's going on anymore. Last Christmas, she gave me the same sweater 3 times. 3 times! That's classic early dementia behavior." I felt my jaw clench, but I stayed where I was. Let him keep talking. Let them all hear exactly what he thought of me. Derek's sister Ashley tried to shush him, glancing nervously in my direction. "Derek, she can probably hear you." "So what if she can? We all know it's true. She's slipping. My mom says she called her 5 times last week asking about the same doctor's appointment. And did you see her at Uncle James's birthday party? She introduced herself to Cousin Tiffany twice in one evening." More relatives had gathered around now, drawn by the commotion. I recognized the faces of those who had benefited from my generosity over the years. Derek's mother Sandra, my youngest sister, who'd been unable to make her house payments 3 years ago until I quietly took care of her mortgage. His uncle Tony, who'd needed a cosigner for his business loan when the banks wouldn't give him the time of day. Ashley herself, who still drove the car I'd bought her for college graduation 4 years ago. "Look, I'm not saying we need to do anything drastic," Derek continued, warming to his audience, "but somebody should probably start helping her manage things. You know, gradually take over the important stuff. Make sure she doesn't get taken advantage of by some scammer or something. And I suppose you think that somebody should be you." This came from Cheryl, who had appeared at the edge of the group with her arms crossed and fire in her eyes. Derek shrugged, unfazed by her obvious disapproval. "I mean, I do work in finance now. I understand investments and all that. It just makes sense." "What makes sense," said a voice from behind them, "is showing some respect for the woman who raised half of you and financially supported the other half." Everyone turned to see my brother Robert approaching the group, his expression darker than I'd seen it in years. At 72, Robert was 5 years my senior and had always been protective of me, especially after our parents died and left us to look after each other. Derek rolled his eyes. "Uncle Robert, no disrespect, but you're not exactly objective here. You live in Aunt Lorraine's property for free." "I live in the cottage that she offered me after my wife died because she knew I needed family nearby," Robert said firmly. "And yes, she charges me nothing because that's the kind of person she is. But that doesn't mean I don't see what's really going on here. And what's really going on? Derek challenged, crossing his arms in a gesture that reminded me uncomfortably of himself as a stubborn teenager. You think your grandmother is losing her mind because it's convenient for you to think that, Robert said. You think if you can convince everyone she's incompetent, you can swoop in and take control of everything she's worked her entire life to build. The group had grown larger now. Nearly the entire family was gathered in a rough circle around Derek and Robert, sensing drama in the air the way families always do. Children had been shuttled inside or to the far end of the yard. This was quickly becoming an adults-only conversation. Sandra stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Robert, Derek didn't mean anything by it. He's just concerned about Mom's well-being. Mom's well-being? Cheryl snorted. Your son is standing in Mom's backyard, eating food she paid for, talking about how she's too senile to manage her own affairs. If you call that concern, I'd hate to see what you call disrespect. Now hold on, Derek said, his voice taking on that whiny quality it always got when he felt cornered. I never said she was senile. I said she was showing signs of memory loss, which is totally different. And for the record, I've been nothing but respectful to Grandma Lorraine my entire life. Respectful? James had joined the fray now, having abandoned the horseshoe game when the shouting started. Is that what you call the time you borrowed $2,000 from her purse when you were in college and never paid it back? Derek's face reddened. That was a loan. She said I could have it. She said you could have $20 for gas money, Cheryl corrected. You took 100 times that and figured she'd be too polite to say anything about it. And what about the time you used her credit card to book that vacation to Cancun? Ashley added quietly. She looked mortified to be speaking against her brother, but the words came out anyway. You told her it was for textbooks. Or the time you convinced her to invest in your friend's startup that turned out to be a complete scam. This from Cousin Malik, who I was surprised to hear speaking up at all. Derek was looking around the circle of family members like a cornered animal. Okay, fine, maybe I made some mistakes when I was younger. But that's exactly my point. She's too trusting. She needs someone to protect her from making bad decisions. The only bad decision she ever made, Robert said slowly, was trusting you. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the children seemed to sense something serious was happening, playing more quietly at the other end of the yard. The only sounds were the hiss of the grill and the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Derek's voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with frustration and something that might have been desperation. You all act like I'm the bad guy here, but somebody needs to face reality. Grandma Lorraine is 87 years old. 67, Cheryl corrected icily. Whatever, she's old, and she's starting to slip. I've seen it myself. She repeats stories, she forgets things, she gets confused about dates and times. These are classic signs of dementia, and if we don't start preparing for it now, we're going to have a real crisis on our hands later. You want to know what I've seen? Said a new voice. Everyone turned to look at my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had apparently been standing just inside my back gate for who knows how long. At 82, she was sprier than most people half her age, and had never been one to mind her own business. Mrs. Patterson, Sandra said weakly, we didn't see you there. I imagine you didn't, the older woman said dryly. I was returning the casserole dish from last week's potluck. Your mother, she nodded in my direction, makes the best sweet potato casserole in 3 states, and I wanted to get the recipe. She walked further into the yard, her sensible shoes clicking against the patio stones. But since I'm here, I think I'll share what I've observed about Lorraine's so-called memory problems. Derek shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Patterson, with all due respect, you're not a medical professional. Neither are you, young man, But I am someone who has coffee with your grandmother every Tuesday morning and lunch with her every Friday afternoon. I am someone who plays bridge with her every other Thursday and goes shopping with her every weekend. So please, enlighten me about these memory problems you've observed. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Derek glanced around at his family members, clearly hoping someone would jump in to support him, but found only skeptical faces staring back. Well, he began hesitantly. Like I said, she repeats stories sometimes. Which stories? Mrs. Patterson asked sharply. I don't know, just stories. About the old days, about when she was young. And when you say she repeats them, do you mean she tells the same story to the same person multiple times in a short period? Or do you mean she tells stories about her life experiences to different people at different times? Derek was quiet for a moment. I guess, the second one. I see. And these forgotten appointments you mentioned? Derek's mother, Sandra, looked increasingly uncomfortable. Now, Mrs. Patterson, I may have misspoken about that. No, please, I'm curious. Your daughter says Lorraine called you 5 times about the same doctor's appointment. Was this because she forgot the appointment itself, or because she wanted clarification about something related to it? Sandra's face was growing redder by the minute. Well, she was asking about whether she needed to bring her insurance card, and then she called back to ask about parking, and then she wanted to know if I thought she should reschedule because of the weather. So she called you multiple times about different aspects of the same appointment because she wanted to make sure she was prepared and didn't want to impose on you by asking everything in one long phone call, Mrs. Patterson summarized. How inconsiderate of her. Derek was starting to look desperate. But what about Christmas? She gave me the same sweater 3 times. Did she? Mrs. Patterson raised an eyebrow. Or did she give you a sweater, which you then returned or exchanged without telling her, leading her to wonder why you never wore it and prompting her to buy you another one? The silence stretched long enough that even the children stopped playing to stare at the adults. Derek's face had gone from red to pale, and he was no longer meeting anyone's eyes. The third sweater, Mrs. Patterson continued relentlessly, came after she saw you at Easter wearing a sweater that looked nothing like the ones she'd given you, leading her to conclude that you didn't like her choices and prompting her to try once more. She mentioned to me that she was worried she didn't understand young people's fashion anymore and wanted to make sure you had something you'd actually wear. Ashley was staring at her brother with a look of dawning horror. Derek, tell me you didn't return Grandma's Christmas presents. I kept some of them, Derek mumbled. You returned your grandmother's Christmas presents. Cheryl's voice could have cut glass. What kind of person does that? They weren't my style. Derek burst out defensively. She always buys me these old-fashioned sweaters and shirts that make me look like I'm 50. I figured she'd never know if I exchanged them for something else. But she did know, Robert said quietly. She always knows. She has for years. She just never said anything because she didn't want to embarrass you or make you feel bad about it. Derek looked around the circle of family members, and I could see the moment when he realized he'd lost them completely. Every face showed some combination of disappointment, anger, and disgust. Even his own mother was looking at him like she didn't recognize him. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice rising again. You're all acting like I'm some kind of villain for being practical about the situation. Grandma Lorraine is getting older, whether you want to admit it or not, and somebody needs to start thinking about what happens when she can't take care of herself anymore. What happens? Came my voice from the porch, causing every head to turn in my direction. Is that I decide what happens. Not you, not your mother, not anyone else in this family, me. I stood up slowly, partly because my arthritis was acting up in the heat, and partly because I wanted to make sure I had everyone's complete attention. The wooden porch creaked under my feet as I walked to the railing. looking down at the sea of faces staring up at me. I've been sitting here for the last 20 minutes, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the yard, listening to my grandson discuss my mental state like I'm not even here. Listening to him plan my future like I'm already dead and buried. Derek opened his mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop him. I've also been listening to the rest of you defend me, which I appreciate more than you know, but I think it's time I defend myself. I made my way down the porch steps, taking my time, letting the anticipation build. When I reached the bottom, I walked directly to Derek, stopping just close enough that he had to look down to meet my eyes. You want to know about my memory, Derek? Let me tell you what I remember. I turned slightly so that my voice would carry to the entire family. I remember when you were 7 years old, and you broke my favorite vase playing football in the house. Your mother wanted to spank you, but I told her accidents happen and bought you a football to play with outside instead. Derek's eyes were fixed on the ground, but I continued. I remember when you were 12 and you stole cigarettes from your uncle's jacket during Christmas dinner. Instead of embarrassing you in front of everyone, I pulled you aside and told you about how smoking killed your grandfather. Do you remember what you promised me that day? He still wouldn't look at me, but he nodded slightly. I remember when you were 16 and you got arrested for spray painting the school gymnasium. I drove to the police station at 2 in the morning and paid your bail because your mother was working a double shift and couldn't leave the hospital. His head came up at that, surprise flickering across his features. I had never told anyone in the family about that night, keeping his secret, because I thought it was what a good grandmother should do. I remember when you were 18 and you needed a car to get to your job at the grocery store. I co-signed the loan because your credit wasn't established yet, and I made the payments the months when your hours got cut. More family members were listening now, learning things about Derek's past they'd never known. I could see Sandra's eyes widening as she realized how much I'd done for her son without ever saying a word. I remember when you were 21 and you came to me crying because you'd failed out of college and didn't know how to tell your parents. I held you while you sobbed, and then I called the school and arranged for you to take a medical withdrawal instead of failing out, preserving your chance to re-enroll later. Derek's face was crumpling now, tears starting to spill down his cheeks, but I wasn't done. I remember when you were 24 and you got your first real job at that tech company. You came to my house wearing your father's old suit because you couldn't afford a new one, and I drove you to the mall and bought you 2 complete outfits because I wanted you to feel confident on your first day. The entire yard was silent, except for Derek's quiet sobs. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing the gravity of the moment. I remember all of this, Derek, and I remember exactly why I did it, because you're my grandson, and I love you, and I wanted to help you become the man I knew you could be. I took a step closer to him, lowering my voice so that only he could hear. What I don't remember, Derek, is ever giving you permission to treat me like I'm incompetent. What I don't remember is asking you to manage my affairs or make decisions about my life. What I don't remember is raising you to be the kind of person who would stand in my backyard and call me senile in front of my entire family. Derek's shoulders were shaking now, but I still wasn't finished. But here's what I do remember, clear as day, I said, my voice rising so everyone could hear again. I remember exactly what's in my will, and I remember exactly who benefits from it, and I remember that I have the power to change both of those things anytime I want. The reaction was immediate and electric. Every adult in that yard suddenly found themselves paying very close attention to our conversation. Even the ones who had been defending me looked nervous, and I realized that despite their loyalty, they had all been counting on inheritance money that they'd never actually earned. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, watching faces around the circle. Some looked guilty, others worried, and a few appeared to be calculating exactly how much they might lose if I decided to cut them out of my will. Finally, Derek managed to choke out, "Grandma, I'm sorry. I didn't mean. Oh, but you did mean it, I interrupted. You meant every word of it. You've been thinking this way for years, probably ever since you found out how much money I have. You've been watching me, cataloging every little mistake, every forgotten word, every repeated story, building a case for why you should be the one controlling my finances. He started to protest, but I held up my hand again. The problem with your case, Derek, is that it's built on a lie. I don't have memory problems. I don't have dementia. I don't repeat stories because I forgot I told them. I repeat them because they're worth telling and because different people need to hear different parts of them. I gestured to the group around us. Most of the people in this yard have heard me tell the story about how I started my first business with $300 and a sewing machine. But each of them heard a different version because each of them needed a different lesson. When I told it to you, Derek, I emphasized the importance of saving money and making smart investments. When I told it to Ashley, I focused on the courage it takes to follow your dreams, even when everyone tells you they're impossible. Ashley's eyes were wide, and I could see recognition dawning on her face as she remembered our conversation from 2 years ago when she'd been afraid to apply to graduate school. I don't call people 5 times about the same appointment because I'm confused. I continued. I call because I want to make sure I have all the information I need, and because talking to my family about everyday things helps me feel connected to your lives. I turned to Sandra, whose face was now streaked with tears. Your mother knows exactly why I call you so often, Sandra. It's because after your father died, you went through a period where you barely spoke to anyone for months. I call you now because I never want you to feel that isolated again, and because hearing about your doctor's appointments and grocery lists and daily routines reminds me that you're taking care of yourself. Sandra nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I never minded the calls, Mom, never. I know you didn't, sweetheart, but your son assumed they were a burden because it's convenient for him to think that everything I do is a burden. It makes it easier to justify taking control of my life. I turned my attention back to Derek, who was still crying but had managed to compose himself enough to look at me directly. Here's what's going to happen, Derek. You're going to sit down at that picnic table over there, and you're going to think very carefully about what kind of man you want to be. You can be the kind of man who takes advantage of an old woman's supposed weakness to get his hands on her money, or you can be the kind of man who earns his own way in the world and treats his family with respect. I gestured toward the table I'd indicated, a worn wooden structure I'd built with my own hands 20 years ago when I'd first bought this property. While you're thinking, I'm going to go inside and get something that I think everyone here needs to see. It's something I've been putting off sharing because I didn't want anyone to feel pressured or uncomfortable. But after today's conversation, I think it's time for some transparency. The family members looked at each other uncertainly as I made my way toward the house. I could hear murmured conversations starting up behind me, but I ignored them. I had something to retrieve, and it was going to change everything. Inside the house, I went to my study, a small room lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets that served as my home office. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick manila folder that I'd been updating regularly for the past 5 years. The folder contained copies of my will, my estate planning documents, and detailed financial records that most of my family had never seen. But more importantly, it contained a letter I'd written to be read at exactly this moment. I returned to the backyard to find that the family had reorganized itself into smaller groups, everyone talking quietly among themselves. Derek was indeed sitting at the table I'd indicated, his head in his hands. When they saw me coming, all conversation stopped. Gather around, everyone, I called out, settling myself back into my chair on the porch. Children, too. They're old enough to understand what's happening here. It took a few minutes for everyone to find places to sit or stand where they could see and hear me clearly. When they were settled, I opened the folder and pulled out several documents. This, I said, holding up a thick packet of papers, is my current will and estate plan. It was last updated 6 months ago, and yes, Derek, I was completely mentally competent when I updated it. In fact, my lawyer requires cognitive testing before any major changes to ensure that his clients are making informed decisions. Derek's eyes widened. Grandma, you don't have to. Oh, but I do have to. You see, you've made it very clear that you think I'm too senile to manage my own affairs. So I think it's only fair that everyone here understands exactly what those affairs entail. I pulled out a financial summary that my accountant had prepared for me, complete with charts and graphs that broke down my assets in easy-to-understand terms. First, let's talk about what we're dealing with here. The family farm that your great-grandparents left me has been developed into a shopping center. I own the land, and I receive rent from every business there. That brings in approximately $12,000 per month. There were sharp intakes of breath around the yard. Most of my family knew I was comfortable, but they had no idea about the specific amounts involved. The house where Derek's mother lives? I own it. I bought it for her when she got divorced, and I've never charged her rent or asked her to contribute to the mortgage payments. The value of that house has appreciated to approximately $400,000 over the past 15 years. Sandra was staring at me in shock. Mom, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, sweetheart. I didn't want you to feel beholden to me or worry about money when you were trying to rebuild your life. I consulted my papers again. The cottage where my brother Robert lives? That's part of a larger property that includes 3 other rental units. The income from those rentals covers the property taxes and maintenance for the entire property, including Robert's cottage. Robert was nodding, but I could see that even he hadn't understood the full scope of things. I also own a substantial investment portfolio that includes stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The total value of my liquid assets is approximately $2.3 million. Now there were gasps. Even I had to admit that seeing the number written out was impressive. I'd been building wealth steadily for 40 years, and it had accumulated faster than even I had expected. Add in the real estate holdings, and we're looking at a total estate value of approximately $4.7 million. The silence that followed was complete. Even the children seemed to understand that this was a very large number. Derek's voice, when he finally found it, was barely a whisper. Grandma, I had no idea. I never meant. I wasn't trying to. Weren't you? I asked. Then why have you been asking your mother about my finances for the past 2 years? Why did you try to convince your Uncle Marcus to talk to me about setting up a trust fund with you as the trustee? Why did you volunteer to help me with my taxes last year and then spend 20 minutes going through my bank statements? His face went white. He thought those conversations had been private, but people talk, especially in families. Here's what I find interesting, Derek. You think I'm too senile to manage money, but somehow you want me to be competent enough to hand control of it over to you. You think I'm too confused to make good decisions, but you trust my judgment enough to leave me in charge of choosing who gets what when I die. I stood up again, folder in hand. Well, let me clear up any confusion about that. I opened the folder to a specific page and began to read. As of the last revision to my will, here's how my estate was to be distributed. Family members leaned forward, and I could see the naked greed in some of their faces. It was disappointing, but not surprising. My daughter Cheryl was to receive the house she grew up in, free and clear, plus $500,000 cash to ensure she could maintain it and provide for her children's education. Cheryl's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately springing to her eyes. My son James was to receive the rental property portfolio, which generates enough income to support a comfortable lifestyle, plus $300,000 cash. James just stared at me, apparently unable to process what he was hearing. My sister Sandra was to receive the house she currently lives in, again free and clear, plus $200,000 to ensure a comfortable retirement. Sandra started sobbing openly, and her daughter Ashley moved to put an arm around her. My brother Robert was to receive lifetime rights to his cottage plus $100,000, with the understanding that he's already received years of free housing. Robert nodded solemnly, his eyes suspiciously bright. Various other family members were to receive smaller amounts, ranging from $20,000 to $50,000 each, depending on our relationship and their needs. I paused here, looking around at the faces of my nieces, nephews, and grandchildren. Most of them looked stunned. Few of them had expected to inherit anything significant. Derek, I continued, was to receive $100,000, the same amount as my other grandchildren. Despite his past mistakes, I loved him and wanted to help him build a better future. The past tense was not lost on anyone, least of all Derek himself. His face had gone from white to green, and he looked like he might be sick. Notice I said was to receive, I continued gently, because one of the advantages of being mentally competent is that I can change these arrangements anytime I want. I pulled out another document, this one freshly printed and still smelling of ink. This is a codicil to my will, dated today and witnessed by Mrs. Patterson and her daughter before the reunion started. Mrs. Patterson nodded from her place near the gate. Lorraine asked me to witness some documents this morning. I had no idea what they were for, but she was certainly lucid and competent when she signed them. This codicil, I continued, removes Derek from my will entirely. His $100,000 inheritance has been redirected to a scholarship fund for students from low-income families who want to study business or entrepreneurship. Derek made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. Several family members gasped, and I saw Cheryl and James exchange worried glances. Additionally, I said, the codicil specifies that if any family member contests this change or attempts to have me declared incompetent in order to invalidate it, they will forfeit their own inheritance, and those funds will also go to the scholarship program. Now everyone was looking nervous. I'd effectively ensured that no one would support Derek if he tried to challenge my mental capacity. Derek, I said, walking over to where he sat at the picnic table, you wanted to control my finances because you thought I wasn't capable of making good decisions. Well, let me tell you about the decision I made this morning. I sat down across from him, setting the folder on the table between us. Up close, I could see that he was trembling. I decided that character matters more than blood. I decided that respect matters more than entitlement. I decided that how someone treats me when they think I'm vulnerable tells me everything I need to know about who they really are. Derek's voice was barely audible. Grandma, please, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'll do anything to make this right. I believe you are sorry, Derek. I believe you're sorrier than you've ever been in your life. But I'm not sure you're sorry for the right reasons. I leaned forward, lowering my voice so that only he could hear. Are you sorry because you realize you hurt me? Or are you sorry because you just lost $100,000? He was quiet for a long time, tears streaming down his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I don't know. I wish I could say it was just about hurting you, but I can't lie anymore. I was counting on that money. I had plans for it. At least he was being honest now. What kind of plans? I wanted to start my own business. I've been working for other people for 6 years, and I thought if I had some startup capital, I could finally be my own boss. I've got this idea for an app that could really take off, but I need funding to develop it properly. I studied his face carefully. And you thought the best way to get that funding was to convince everyone I was senile so you could take control of my money. No, he said quickly, then stopped himself. I mean, maybe. I don't know. I convinced myself I was looking out for you, but really, I was looking out for me. I saw an opportunity, and I took it, and I told myself it was for your own good. The honesty was refreshing, even if it was devastating. Derek, Do you know why I've been so generous with this family over the years? He shook his head. Because I wanted to help people build better lives for themselves. Your mother's house, your Uncle Robert's cottage, the money I've given to cousins for education and business ventures, all of that was about giving people the foundation they needed to succeed. I gestured toward the folder. This inheritance plan was designed with the same philosophy. Give people enough to be secure, to take care of their families, to pursue their dreams, but not so much that they'd never have to work or strive for anything. Derek was listening intently now, and I could see understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. But you, Derek, you wanted to skip all that. You didn't want to earn your way to success. You wanted to inherit your way there. You didn't want to build character through struggle. You wanted to take shortcuts through manipulation. I know, he whispered. I know, and I hate myself for it. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us aware that the rest of the family was watching and listening to every word. Finally, I reached across the table and took his hand. Derek, I love you. I always have, and I always will. But love doesn't mean enabling bad behavior or rewarding poor choices. He nodded, squeezing my hand tightly. However, I continued, I've always believed in second chances. His head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since this conversation had started. The codicil I signed this morning contains one additional provision. If you can demonstrate over the next year that you've learned from this experience, that you can build something on your own, treat people with respect, and contribute positively to this family, then your inheritance can be restored. How? He asked eagerly. What do I need to do? That's up to you to figure out, but I'll give you a hint. It has nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. Derek nodded frantically. I can do that. I will do that. I promise you, Grandma. I'm going to prove that I'm worthy of your trust again. We'll see, I said gently. Actions speak louder than words, and you've got a year's worth of actions to account for. I stood up from the table and addressed the rest of the family. I hope today's conversation has been enlightening for everyone. I'm not senile, I'm not incompetent, and I'm certainly not anyone's meal ticket. Looking around at their faces, I saw a mixture of relief, embarrassment, and respect that hadn't been there before. Good. Now, I said, clapping my hands together, I believe we were in the middle of a family reunion. Derek, you're welcome to stay, but I think you owe some people apologies. The rest of you, let's eat some barbecue before it gets cold. The tension began to dissolve slowly as people started moving around again. Conversations resumed, though more quietly than before. Derek remained at the picnic table, staring at his hands, while family members approached him one by one for whispered conversations. Cheryl was the first to reach me, wrapping me in a fierce hug. Mom, I had no idea about any of this. The money, the will, what Derek was saying about you. I know, sweetheart, I kept it quiet on purpose. But maybe it's time this family understood that respect isn't optional, and neither is earning your way in the world. James joined us, pulling both his mother and sister into a group hug that lasted longer than any of us had expected. When we finally separated, there were tears in all of our eyes. Mom, James said quietly, I never once thought you were anything other than sharp as a tack, but I should have spoken up sooner when Derek started running his mouth. You both defended me when it mattered, I replied. That's what I'll remember. Over the next hour, the family reunion slowly returned to something resembling normalcy. Children went back to playing, adults resumed their conversations, and the grill was fired up again to reheat the food that had gone cold during our confrontation. But there was an undercurrent of thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before. People spoke more carefully, looked at each other more directly, and treated me with a kind of respectful attention that was both gratifying and a little sad. Derek remained at the picnic table for most of this time, accepting visits from various family members. Some came to comfort him, others to express their disappointment, and a few to simply try to understand what had happened. Through it all, he sat quietly, nodding when appropriate, apologizing when necessary, but mostly just listening. Ashley spent a long time talking with her brother, and I could see from her gestures and expressions that she was giving him some much-needed perspective on his behavior. Sandra approached him near the end of the day, and their conversation was too quiet for me to hear, but it ended with a long embrace that suggested forgiveness, if not complete understanding. As the afternoon wore on, and the sun began to sink lower in the sky, family members started packing up their things and saying their goodbyes. It had been an emotionally exhausting day for everyone, and I think most people were ready to go home and process what they'd learned. Robert was among the last to leave, helping me clean up the yard and put away the extra chairs we'd brought out for the occasion. As we worked, he kept glancing over at Derek, who was still sitting at the picnic table even though most of his immediate family had already gone. "You were right to do what you did," Robert said, as we stacked the last of the folding chairs. "That boy needed a wake-up call." "I hope it was enough," I replied. "Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we have to learn about ourselves." "He'll figure it out. He's got good genes, even if he hasn't always shown it." I smiled at that. "We all make mistakes, Robert. The question is whether we learn from them." Finally, only Derek and I remained in the backyard. The caterers had long since packed up and left, taking most of the evidence of the day's festivities with them. The yard looked strangely empty without the crowds of people and tables full of food. Derek stood up from the picnic table and walked over to where I was sitting on the porch. He looked older somehow, like the events of the day had aged him in ways that went beyond the passage of time. "Grandma," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. "Take your time," I told him gently. "We've got all evening." He sat down on the porch steps, close enough that we could talk without raising our voices. "I've been thinking about what you said, about character and earning things and proving myself. And I realize I don't even know where to start. I've been taking shortcuts for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to do things the right way." I nodded. "That's actually a good place to start, Derek. Recognizing that you don't know something is the first step toward learning it." "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How did you do it? How did you build all of this?" He gestured around the property, but I knew he meant more than just the house and yard. I thought about that question for a moment. It was something I'd been asked before, but usually by people who wanted to know about investment strategies or business plans. Derek was asking something deeper. "I started with very little," I said finally. "Your great-grandparents left me this property, but it was just undeveloped farmland then. The house was tiny, barely more than a cabin. I had a high school education and $300 in savings." Derek listened intently, and I could see he was genuinely interested in understanding rather than just looking for quick tips or shortcuts. "The first thing I did was get a job at the textile mill in town. It was hard work, long hours, and the pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and it gave me a foundation to build on." I remembered those early days clearly, waking up before dawn, walking 3 miles to the mill because I couldn't afford a car, working 10-hour shifts in a hot, noisy factory, then walking home to collapse into bed, only to do it all again the next day. While I was working at the mill, I started taking in sewing on the side. Wedding dresses, alterations, custom clothes for people in town. I'd work on them in the evenings and on weekends, saving every penny I could. "How long did you do that?" 5 years. 5 years of working 2 jobs, living on beans and rice, patching my clothes instead of buying new ones. But by the end of those 5 years, I had saved enough money to buy my first sewing machine and rent a small shop downtown. Derek's eyes widened. "You opened your own business after only 5 years?" "I did. And it was terrifying. I had no idea what I was doing. I'd never run a business before, never done accounting, never dealt with suppliers or customers in a professional setting. I made 1,000 mistakes in the first year alone. But you didn't quit. I couldn't quit, not just because I'd invested everything I had in that shop, but because quitting would have meant admitting that all those years of sacrifice had been for nothing. More importantly, I was starting to see that I was good at this. I had an eye for design, a talent for working with people, and a stubborn streak that wouldn't let me give up. The business had grown slowly but steadily. Word spread about my work, and soon I was doing custom tailoring for the wealthy families in the county. That led to contracts with local businesses for uniforms, which led to connections with regional suppliers, which eventually led to opportunities I could never have imagined when I was working at the mill. The real breakthrough came about 10 years later. I continued. The town was talking about developing some of the farmland on the outskirts, and I realized that the property your great-grandparents left me was right in the path of that development. So you sold it? I sold part of it, but not all. I kept the piece where we're sitting now for my home, and I negotiated a deal where I would lease the rest to developers rather than selling it outright. That way, I'd have ongoing income from the property instead of just a one-time payment. That decision had been the foundation of my long-term wealth. As the shopping center grew and thrived, my monthly rental income grew with it. I'd reinvested that money in other properties, in stocks, in bonds, always being careful not to put all my eggs in one basket. But here's the thing, Derek, I said, leaning forward to look him directly in the eye. None of that would have mattered if I hadn't learned the basics first. Working hard, saving money, treating people with respect, keeping my word, learning from my mistakes. The business success, the property development, the investments, all of that came later, after I'd proven to myself and others that I could be trusted with responsibility. Derek was quiet for a long time, absorbing what I'd told him. Finally, he asked, "Do you think I can learn those things? The basics, I mean?" "I know you can," I said without hesitation. "The question is whether you will." "What's the difference?" "The difference is that can is about ability, and will is about choice. You have the ability, Derek. You're smart, you're capable, and you're young enough to recover from your mistakes. But you have to choose to do the work, even when it's hard, even when it's boring, even when no one is watching." He nodded slowly. "Where do I start?" "That's up to you to figure out. But if you want my advice, I'd say start by taking a hard look at how you treat the people in your life. Today you called me senile in front of my entire family because you thought it would help you get what you wanted. Ask yourself, is that the kind of person you want to be?" Derek winced at the reminder, but he didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. That was progress. "I also think you should start earning things instead of expecting them to be handed to you. You want to start your own business? Great. Save up the money to do it. Learn about entrepreneurship, study successful business models, talk to people who've built companies from scratch. Don't look for someone else's money to fund your dreams." "But that could take years," he protested. "So?" The simple question hung in the air between us. I could see Derek struggling with the concept of delayed gratification, something he'd never really had to deal with before. "Derek, I'm 67 years old. It took me 40 years to build what I have. 40 years of working, saving, learning, making mistakes, and trying again. Did you really think you could bypass all of that and jump straight to success just because you're my grandson?" He shook his head, looking ashamed. "When you put it like that, it sounds pretty arrogant." It was arrogant, but arrogance can be cured with experience if you're willing to learn from it. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the trees. The air was starting to cool, and I could hear crickets beginning their evening chorus. "Grandma," Derek said eventually, Can I ask you to do something for me? I raised an eyebrow. That depends on what it is. Can you hold me accountable? I know I don't have the right to ask for your help after what I did today, but I'm afraid if I try to change on my own, I'll just slip back into old habits when things get difficult. I considered his request carefully. What exactly are you asking me to do? I don't know. Check in with me sometimes. Ask me hard questions. Call me out when I'm making excuses or taking shortcuts. It was an interesting request, and I had to admit I was impressed that he'd thought to ask for it. Most people who promised to change never considered that they might need external accountability to follow through. I'm willing to do that, I said finally. But on one condition. What's that? You have to be completely honest with me. No sugarcoating, no telling me what you think I want to hear, no trying to make yourself look better than you are. If I'm going to help you change, I need to know the truth about where you're starting from. Derek nodded eagerly. I can do that. I promise. We'll see. Promises are easy to make, Derek. It's keeping them that's hard. I know, but I want to try. I want to be better than I've been. There was something in his voice that convinced me he meant it, at least in that moment. Whether he'd still mean it when the work got hard remained to be seen. All right then, I said, standing up from my chair. Let's start with something simple. Tomorrow is Monday. I want you to call me and tell me 3 specific things you did that day to improve yourself or help someone else. Not big things, just small actions that show you're thinking differently about how you live your life. I can do that. And Derek, don't try to impress me with grand gestures or dramatic changes. I'm more interested in seeing consistent small improvements than sporadic bursts of effort. He stood up as well, brushing off his pants. Thank you, Grandma, for the second chance, for the accountability, for everything. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful you're willing to give it to me. Everyone deserves a second chance, Derek, but third chances are earned. He hugged me then, a real embrace that lasted longer than our usual perfunctory goodbye hugs. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm going to make you proud of me, he said. I promise. I already am proud of you, I replied. You admitted you were wrong, you apologized sincerely, and you asked for help. That took courage. Now, let's see if you can sustain that courage over the long term. Derek left shortly after that, and I spent the rest of the evening cleaning up and reflecting on the day's events. It had been emotionally exhausting, but also cathartic in a way. For too long, I'd allowed Derek to treat me with subtle disrespect, because I didn't want to cause family drama. Today had proven that sometimes drama is necessary to clear the air and reset expectations. As I got ready for bed that night, I thought about the other family members and how they'd reacted to the day's revelations. Cheryl and James had both seemed genuinely surprised by the extent of my wealth, but not in a way that suggested they'd been counting on it or planning around it. That was reassuring. Sandra had been embarrassed by her son's behavior, but she'd also defended me when it mattered. Robert had been his usual steady, supportive self. The rest of the family had mostly stayed out of the immediate conflict, but I'd seen respect in their eyes when I'd stood up for myself. The week following the reunion was quieter than usual. Derek called me every day as promised, sometimes struggling to come up with 3 meaningful actions he'd taken, but always honest about his efforts and his failures. On Tuesday, he told me he'd helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries up to her apartment. On Wednesday, he'd stayed late at work to help a younger colleague with a project. On Thursday, he'd resisted the urge to use his credit card for an impulse purchase and instead put that money into savings. They were small things, but I could hear a shift in how he talked about them. Instead of treating them like obligations he was fulfilling to please me, he started to sound like someone who was genuinely trying to build better habits. Other family members reached out during that week as well. Cheryl called to ask if I wanted company for dinner. James invited me to his son's soccer game. Sandra came by with a homemade apple pie and stayed for coffee and conversation that lasted 3 hours. It seemed that the confrontation at the reunion had reminded everyone that family relationships require active effort, not just blood ties. 3 weeks later, Derek asked if he could come over to talk. When he arrived, he looked different somehow, more serious, more grounded. He sat down across from me in my living room and pulled out a notebook. "I've been thinking about what you said about starting my own business," he began, "about saving money and learning everything I can first. And? And I realized I don't actually know enough about business to succeed, even if I had all the funding in the world. So I've been doing research." He opened his notebook and showed me pages of handwritten notes, information about business licenses, market research, financial planning, legal requirements. It was more thorough research than I'd expected him to be capable of. I also talked to my boss about the possibility of taking on more responsibility at work. Derek continued, "Not for more money right away, but to learn more about how the business operates from the management side." What did he say? He said he'd been waiting for me to show that kind of initiative. He's going to let me shadow him during budget meetings and client presentations. He said if I prove myself, there might be opportunities for advancement. I was impressed, despite myself. That sounds like excellent progress. It is, but I also realized something else. Derek closed the notebook and looked at me directly. "I've been so focused on wanting to be my own boss that I never bothered to learn how to be a good employee first. How can I expect to run a successful business if I can't even excel at working for someone else?" This was exactly the kind of insight I'd been hoping he would develop. That's very wise, Derek. I have a lot to learn. About work, about business, about treating people correctly. But for the first time, I feel like I'm on the right path, instead of just looking for shortcuts. We talked for another hour about his plans and goals. He'd set up a savings account specifically for his future business and was contributing to it every month. He'd started reading books about entrepreneurship and business management. He'd even joined a local networking group for young professionals. More importantly, he seemed to understand that building a successful business was about more than just having a good idea or adequate funding. It was about developing the skills, knowledge, and character necessary to lead others and serve customers effectively. When he got up to leave, Derek paused at the door. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think that codicil you signed will ever... is there a chance that you might earn your inheritance back?" I finished for him. He nodded, looking hopeful, but trying not to appear too eager. "Derek, I told you that actions speak louder than words. You've been taking the right actions for a few weeks now. Keep it up for a year, and we'll talk about it then." "That's fair," he said. "More than fair, actually." After he left, I found myself feeling cautiously optimistic about his future. The change might not be permanent, and he might still face setbacks along the way, but at least he was moving in the right direction. 6 months after the reunion, Derek called to invite me to a company party. He'd been promoted to a supervisory position and wanted me to meet his colleagues. I accepted the invitation, curious to see how he was applying the lessons he'd been learning. The party was held at a local restaurant, and I was surprised by how many people came up to me throughout the evening to tell me positive things about Derek. His boss mentioned that Derek had become one of his most reliable employees. A colleague spoke about how Derek had helped him through a difficult project. A newer employee described Derek as a patient and encouraging mentor. Derek himself seemed different in this environment. More confident but not arrogant, more engaged with others, more focused on contributing to conversations rather than dominating them. When he introduced me as his grandmother, it was with obvious pride and affection, rather than the perfunctory acknowledgement I'd grown accustomed to. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about the power of accountability and second chances. Derek hadn't magically transformed overnight, but he had committed to a process of gradual improvement and stuck with it even when it was difficult. As we approached the 1-year anniversary of the reunion, I made a decision. I called my lawyer and asked him to prepare another codicil to my will. This one would restore Derek's inheritance, but with conditions. The money would be held in trust until he turned 35, and it could only be used for education, starting a business, or buying a home. If he violated the terms of the trust or reverted to his old patterns of behavior, the money would go to charity. When I told Derek about this decision, his reaction surprised me. Instead of excitement about the money, his first question was whether I thought he'd truly earned it back. I do, I told him, but more importantly, you've earned something much more valuable than money. What's that? Self-respect, and the respect of others. No one can take that away from you, and no one can give it to you. You had to earn it yourself. The second annual family reunion was a very different affair from the first. Derek arrived early to help set up tables and chairs. He spent the day talking with relatives he'd previously ignored, playing games with the children, and offering to help with cleanup at the end. When someone made a casual comment about my age and memory, Derek was quick to defend me, pointing out specific examples of my sharpness and competence. When a cousin asked about inheritance and estate planning, Derek changed the subject, suggesting it wasn't appropriate to discuss such matters at a family gathering. He had become exactly the kind of person I'd always hoped he could be: respectful, responsible, and genuinely caring about others. The transformation wasn't complete. Character development is a lifelong process, but the foundation was solid. As the day wound down and family members began to leave, I reflected on what had changed in a year. The family dynamics were healthier, with people treating each other with more consideration and respect. Conversations were more genuine, less focused on what people could get from each other, and more on how they could support one another. Derek had learned to delay gratification, work hard for his goals, and treat others with dignity. But perhaps more importantly, the entire family had learned that respect isn't automatic, and that loving someone doesn't mean enabling their worst impulses. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not just because Derek had redeemed himself, but because I had stood up for myself when it mattered most. For too many years, I'd let small slights and disrespectful behaviors slide because I didn't want to cause problems or hurt feelings. The reunion confrontation had taught me that sometimes causing problems in the short term is necessary to solve bigger problems in the long term. Sometimes, hurting someone's feelings is the only way to get their attention and motivate them to change. I was proud of Derek for the man he was becoming, but I was also proud of myself for having the courage to hold him accountable. Love isn't just about acceptance and support, it's also about setting boundaries and maintaining standards. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the letter I'd written to be read at exactly that moment a year ago. In it, I'd expressed my hope that calling out Derek's behavior would serve as a wake-up call, not just for him, but for the entire family. Looking back, I believed that hope had been fulfilled. The family was stronger, more honest in their relationships, and more appreciative of what they had, rather than focused on what they wanted to gain. Derek still called me every Monday to tell me about his week, not because I'd asked him to continue, but because he said it helped him stay focused on being the kind of person he wanted to be. We'd developed a deeper relationship than we'd ever had before, one based on mutual respect rather than obligation or expectation. The business he was planning to start remained years in the future, but he was building toward it methodically, saving money, gaining experience, and developing the skills he would need to succeed. He understood now that there were no shortcuts to lasting success, no substitutes for hard work and integrity. Most importantly, he had learned that a person's worth isn't measured by how much money they have or inherit, but by how they treat others and what they contribute to the world around them. It was a lesson that had taken him far too long to learn, but one that would serve him well for the rest of his life. As for me, I continued to manage my own affairs with the same competence I'd always possessed. My memory remained sharp, my judgment sound, and my independence intact. I made my own decisions about my money, my property, and my relationships, just as I always had. The inheritance terms remained essentially unchanged, with trust provisions added to Derek's restored portion to ensure the money would be used wisely. I had no regrets about the confrontation at the reunion or the lessons that followed. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to enable their worst impulses and force them to confront the consequences of their choices. Derek had called me senile at that family reunion, thinking he could use my supposed incompetence to justify taking control of my finances. Instead, he learned that I was sharper than he'd given me credit for, stronger than he'd assumed, and more than capable of holding him accountable for his actions. In the end, both of us were better for it. He became a man of character and integrity, and I reclaimed the respect that had been lacking in our relationship for far too long. The family learned that love requires honesty, that respect must be earned and maintained, and that sometimes the most difficult conversations are the most necessary ones. The inheritance terms I'd read aloud that day had been about more than money. They'd been about values, priorities, and the kind of people we choose to be. Derek had chosen to be better, and that was worth more than any amount of money I could leave him. Years from now, when I'm no longer here to speak for myself, I hope Derek will remember not just the financial legacy I left him, but the example I set of standing up for myself and demanding to be treated with dignity. I hope he'll pass those lessons on to his own children and grandchildren, creating a family culture of mutual respect and accountability. That would be the greatest inheritance of all.